What we've got to remember is that we are, very many of us who are parenting neurodivergent children are also neurodivergent themselves.
Yeah.
And only understanding this later on in life, we can see it manifest in our children and those external outbursts, but we're the ones containing it and holding it in. To women who are listening to this and feel overwhelmed and exhausted and burnt out and depleted because they are doing this juggle of trying to help themselves, regulate themselves, take responsibility for their own mental health, but also think, right, I want my children to not go through what I went through. I want my children to feel more supported. So many women have been diagnosed with anxiety when the actual root is ADHD and autism.
Today, I'm joined by Kate Mouyousef, host of the ADHD Women's Wellbeing podcast, certified wellbeing coach, and now author of the brilliant new book, The ADHD Women's Wellbeing Toolkit. Kate is a leading voice in the ADHD space, especially when it comes to recognizing how ADHD shows up in women and girls, often quietly, often misunderstood, and often misdiagnosed. Through her work, she's helped thousands of women feel seen, supported, and more connected to who they really are, beyond the overwhelm, the guilt, and the mental load. Kate, it's a pleasure to have you here on the podcast today, so thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Can you start off by telling us a little bit about your journey with ADHD and what led you to start supporting other women and mums through your podcast and now your new book?
So thank you. I was diagnosed with ADHD nearly 6 years ago now. Wow. Back in November 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And is that nearly 6 years ago? Nearly 5 years ago, however many years. It feels like it's over 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment when my daughter was diagnosed about 3 weeks before. She was 9 at the time. And I started seeing the same traits and the same characteristics and things that it was almost like a flashback of seeing myself in her 9-year-old body. And then being able to get these answers as to why I have felt always slightly different, or all the many reasons why I felt more overwhelmed, struggled with sort of anxiety, academia. My brain just worked in very different ways and I never had the answers for it.
Mm-hmm.
And it also helped me understand all the different hormonal connections as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't learn this all in the space of, a week of being diagnosed. It's been sort of a constant learning throughout these 5 years. But it was at that moment when we both got diagnosed within a couple of weeks of each other back in 2020 that I wanted to explore more. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to help my daughter more. I wanted to help myself more. I understood what ADHD was because my brothers were diagnosed with it when we were much younger, really a very long time ago, back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, really when it was only just being talked about and it was starting to, gather conversation, but only in boys.
Mm-hmm.
So there was only this conversation happening in boys. I only knew what it looked like in boys. I only understood what it looked like from a very surface level. Exterior, there was never a conversation about the internal sort of landscape of ADHD. And I decided that I was going to start a podcast. I was already doing a podcast. So I already had a podcast called The Ambitious Mum, which is kind of like the precursor to me asking these questions is, why am I always busy? Why do I always want to be productive? Why am I always doing? Why do I feel burnt out? Can I not just be present as a mum? And that was all the questioning, but there was never an ADHD explanation.
Yeah.
So I decided to finish The Ambitious Mum. And then that's what led me to starting the ADHD Women's Wellbeing podcast. And that was back in 2022, January 2022. And it was very much me just saying, right, I need the answers. And if I'm not the only person here that's going to need those answers.
Yeah.
And it was at that very beginning turning point of the conversation of ADHD in women and girls, very, very early on, where there was a few articles coming out. There was still a lot of stigma. There was still a lot of, women can't get ADHD, or, what does ADHD look like in girls? And thankfully, the podcast it just kind of like exploded almost, within 2 or 3 months because people were waiting for these conversations. And so I was learning on the job, sharing what I was learning, and it's still going. And, 3 million downloads later, there's a lot of people that want answers. There's a lot of people that want to find out how they can get support, and what does ADHD look like for them, and perhaps what did ADHD look like for their grandparents, their mums, their aunties, their cousins. There's so many generations that never had these answers. So that's why I keep pushing on with it, and this is why I wrote the book as well.
I love that. It's an incredible story. And it is a story I hear quite a lot, actually, isn't it? That you will get a diagnosis for your child and then you really start to look inward and start to recognize some of those patterns of behavior in yourself. And then people are getting diagnosed later on in life, and it's answering a lot of questions for them about, gosh, it's a real epiphany as to their own upbringing and how they feel about things internally. So it is amazing to be having these conversations and to have the support through things like your podcast, because like you say, it wasn't around years ago. It was only recognized in boys, and it was only seen as a kind of, want for a better word, a naughty, hyperactive behavior. We weren't understanding all the behaviors that come, or understanding especially how it shows up in girls.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, ADHD in girls is still very much misunderstood. What would you say are some of the signs that we really miss, especially in young girls?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to start spotting these signs really early on. I'll give you an example with my daughter. I've got 3 daughters, and they've all been diagnosed. I've got 4 kids. All my kids have had a diagnosis of some form of ADHD. And in all 4 of them, 3 girls, 1 boy, it all manifests and looks quite different. So that has to be caveated, because one person's ADHD will look different. And I think as the language and we understand this landscape more, the words, the way we articulate it will change with neurodivergence and this sort of neurodiverse understanding with, the integration of how ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, sensory processing differences. It's all, they morph so differently and so individually that it can be hard to say, well, one person looks like this and another person looks like that. But I'm going to speak quite generally.
Yeah.
With girls, there's a tendency for like an early onset of anxiety, of maybe being scared at night to go to sleep, lots of fear and worry about bedtime, but also things like, I would say, like friendship, feeling very sensitive about friendships, feeling very sensitive about being left out. And there's something with ADHD that is coined rejection sensitive dysphoria, RSD, that people may have heard about.
Yeah.
And it can present quite early on. It can present quite early on in girls, where maybe neurodivergent girls are noticing these dynamics play out in female friendships, and they feel like they're not being included, or they feel very sensitive that certain people aren't letting them play in the way they want to, or all these different dynamics. It can show up in maybe sensory processing, differences, feelings of clothes, feelings of, smells, noises. It can show up in so many different ways, with perhaps, starting school.
Yeah.
And feeling very overstimulated, very overwhelmed when they get home. So they come home and perhaps everything's been fine at school because they've been trying so hard and holding everything in to be that good girl, to do things perfectly, to please everybody. And then they come home and it's often the parents that get the brunt of this vacuum, this sort of like explosion that comes out, and they have a meltdown or they have a tantrum, and there's sort of this explosion that we have to deal with as parents, and maybe sort of certain very quite extreme food dislikes, again, sensory kind of things around food. So it's a jigsaw puzzle, and you can put in those jigsaws. Now, there's also the great side. There's, you might have a child that's really creative. You might have a child that loves being outside and being sporty, and you notice the best of them come out when they are active and they're being creative and they can lose themselves in games. Again, one of my daughters was amazing. She would play with her Barbies for hours and create like imaginative games and do this whole thing, and she would keep herself quiet for ages in her imaginary little world.
Yeah.
And then another one would be just crave being outside, crave moving her body, almost be like ants in her, like it's just like so restless that we had to go outside, we had to go on a run or a bike ride or gymnastics. So it is piecing it together. Again, I probably haven't spoken about lots of other ways it can show up, but it's being able to recognize, okay, you can have a neurodivergent child and maybe you're supporting them intuitively and knowingly, creating an environment that feels really good to them and they're thriving. And that's great. We don't have to pathologize everything. We don't have to give everything a diagnosis. But what we need, the awareness needs to come is when the child's struggling, or when the child feels that they are being made to fit into a certain box that's not working for them.
Yes.
Or they are feeling overwhelmed and overstimulated and really sort of wired in situations that aren't, that don't complement them.
Yeah.
And then that's when we need to start looking at it. But I would say, if you have a neurodivergent child and they are thriving because of the things that you've put in place and the way the school has put things in place, and they are doing activities and they've got like an output for it, then that's brilliant. So it's just being able to keep that balance and looking at it and seeing where you can help and where they need that extra support, or perhaps where there is something quite a little bit more serious going on as well.
So in your experience, in what sort of age do these sort of traits of behaviour start showing up, so that parents know what they're looking for and know maybe when to try and seek that diagnosis?
So on reflection, I look back at my kids, and my eldest is actually 20 today. So I'm able to have like a 20-year span of seeing how all these different neurodiverse qualities have shown up. And if I'm honest, my 2 kids, well, 3 of them had reflux. And we do know now there is research saying that gastrointestinal problems, reflux, sleeplessness as kids can be, correlated to that. So again, not all children, but maybe that is, starting to think, okay, has there been allergies, gut problems, sleep issues, more of an anxious disposition where they have needed a lot more, there's certain kids that you can just leave them, they're great, they're super independent, throw them into any situation and they're fine, birthday parties, different, people's houses, where one of my kids would like to go to noisy places. Like, we had to leave all noisy places. We had to, I really had to manage their environment.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I've just got a really sensitive kid. And I almost thought that maybe I'm doing this, because I'm over managing the situation. Maybe I'm creating the problem. But I realized it was his reaction to the situation. So I was reacting to his reaction. So it wasn't like, so I'd realize, okay, so a noisy cafe didn't work. A very overstimulating play area, that was not a good thing.
Yeah.
Where they did thrive, outside, playgrounds, walks, in nature, quieter places, maybe like the library, or where they wanted to go type thing. I pulled back from people's houses, which I knew were totally, not for him, where there was a lot of kind of noise and stimulation and all sorts going on. And
did you ever find that tough to do? Like, as in, there can be expectation from other people to maybe go to that party, go to that family event.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work for your child, there can be a lot of pressure on you as the parent to adhere and to actually advocate for your child and do what is right for them. I think that's quite tough, isn't it?
Yeah, and judgment. And again, I look back at those times and there was no one was talking about any of this, 15, 20 years ago, no one. So there was that element of, you're being a bit overprotective, or you're a bit neurotic, or you're creating an anxious child. But I recognized in that child that they didn't enjoy being in that environment. Or when we left that environment, the meltdown would happen.
Yeah.
And I would then have to deal with a 2-hour situation of I needing to find a way to decompress and calm and regulate. And I thought, is it worth it? Like, no one's enjoying this here. So I think the conversation I was opening, where there's slightly less judgment, we can say, you know what, my child doesn't really love noisy birthday parties, or understanding where they thrive or what they enjoy doing. So I do think there's an element of, yes, as parents, we need to give them a little push and a little nudge. But I wonder back, 20, 30 years ago, we just like, no, get on with it, deal with it, and now we have a bit more of an understanding where we find that balance. So we can get our kids, to be resilient and, survive in this very neurotypical world, and especially neurotypical schooling that so many, kids are finding themselves in. But also, like, what can we do? Like, what's within our control of helping and supporting our children as well?
Yeah, and I love that. I think managing the environment does play a big part, doesn't it? I know from my own personal experience, my son has dyslexia, and he has always come home and had overwhelming outbursts. And I find it's that piece when I shut the front door that nobody else is privy to. That, you know, when I leave a party or a family event early and people they will sort of comment that, you know, well, you are being overprotective or he seems fine.
Yeah.
But like you say, you do get home and think, is it worth it? When you see your child that dysregulated and unhappy, and it can take an hour or two to settle them back down and help calm their nervous system again, that you do learn to manage that environment. But it is tough. It is tough at times when you can feel the external pressure and judgment, you know, and I know it comes from a lack of understanding. People don't mean it, but it is an added load to the already heavy load as a mother.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we've got to remember is that we are, you know, very many of us who are parenting neurodivergent children are also neurodivergent themselves, and only understanding this later on in life. So what we are, I guess my audience who I speak to are the women who are late in life diagnosed, who are only just understanding this while also supporting their kids. And you talked about this dysregulated nervous system that we've operated on this nervous system our whole lives. We know what this feels like. We know, you know, we can see it manifest in our children and those external outbursts, but we're the ones containing it and holding it in, which is what, you know, in my book, in the ADHD Women's Wellbeing Toolkit, I have a whole section on our nervous system. I have a whole section on our anxiety. And I really dedicate the whole book to speaking to that person who is only just understanding what this looks like for themselves, often with this collision of perimenopause or looking back, you know, postnatally. There's a much higher incidence of postnatal depression in neurodivergent women, PMDD, really challenging, you know, cycles and hormonal fluctuations. So we are, as women, tackling and holding a lot for ourselves while also trying to help our children now with much more updated information. It's still not there. We're still not understanding fully everything, but at least we're able to advocate for our children a little bit better, you know, through schooling and hopefully support, you know, therapeutic support and coaching. So I just want to acknowledge to women who are listening to this and feel overwhelmed and exhausted and burnt out and depleted because they are doing this juggle of trying to help themselves, regulate themselves, take responsibility for their own mental health, but also think, right, I want my children to not go through what I went through. I want my children to feel more supported than what I had to deal with, which was probably absolutely no support and parents that had no idea what was going on while they were also navigating their own completely undiagnosed neurodivergence. So it's a bit of a collision of lots of things. Very specifically for this generation, I want to say that we are this generation of women. Again, I'm not quite sure how old your audience is, but I'm going to say from 40 plus. It's a very specific generation of women who are going, oh my goodness, so maybe I am autistic or ADHD. And that's why I can understand why one of my parents was like that, or both my parents were like that, and how that played out in my childhood and the trauma and so many different things, while also parenting a child with neurodiversity as well. So yeah, it's quite a unique landscape that we're navigating.
It really is. So let's talk about school then. What kind of support should parents be looking for if they suspect that their child has ADHD?
So here in the UK, we know that the SEND departments can vary. Some schools and some local authorities have amazing support and some less so. And I can see that there's still not an equal, you know, it's a bit potluck, unfortunately. But what I would say is if you have the resources and you have the knowledge and you have the learning, I would say really be your child's advocate. I always think we do know, like you say, you know what your son is like after school, after a party, after going to someone's house, and we know what that looks like after school. I knew what my daughter was like after school and what the teacher could see in school, and it was very, very different. So I had to go in and speak to my the teacher. But I also explained, I said, look at her fingernails, they're all bitten down, all her cuticles are bitten down. Look at her doodling all over her hands, look at her folder, look at her iPad, everything is graffitied and doodled. Look at her tights have been pulled to threads. That is her way of regulating herself while trying to concentrate and trying to keep herself focused. So although you may see a quiet girl, maybe looking out the window, maybe sometimes interrupting or having a giggle with her friends, or maybe distracting someone, what you need to know is that she is desperately trying to focus and concentrate, and she is trying not to be disruptive in a class that's 25 kids, all sorts of things going on, and the teacher is not neuro affirming anything, not helping the children process the information or telling the children this is the only way you can process that information and there's no other option. If you don't process things, through reading a comprehension and writing it out, then what you're going to do, you're going to look out the window, you're going to not listen to the instructions, you're going to distract someone else, you're going to ask someone else for their help, you might copy someone's, work. And there's so much academic trauma, again, maybe from our generation. Or you have on the flip side, you have the very, very anxious child that is overcompensating and trying to catch up all the time and feeling so worried that they are behind and they're never going to be good enough. And they are thinking there's something wrong with them because, again, the way they learn or process is very different to what, the school is doing. So we have to advocate for our children. We have to learn, get them assessed, get them diagnosed, find ways that you can support them, but how the school can support them, and take it from there, and hope that you find a knowledgeable teacher, a teacher that's willing to collaborate with you, cooperate with you, and don't give up. Don't give up, because if many children who are neurodivergent are also highly intelligent and have huge amounts of potential. And again, we might have this situation where loads of people haven't reached their potential. We know a very high percentage of people, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system and prison are neurodivergent. Something like, there's figures out there, something like as above 80% dyslexic, ADHD, autistic. They didn't get that support at school. So we have to do that, and we have to fulfill our kids' potential and find ways where they can, I guess, learn what they're interested in, find ways, support them in the subjects that they really, really love, and find ways that they are enthusiastic about learning.
And I think that's a really key point. It is about helping them learn what they are good at. Just because they don't fit into the schooling system with the way that education is currently delivered doesn't mean that they don't have skills of their own. And it's frustrating sometimes that being in that schooling system, when you're constantly faced with ways that you don't process information, can kind of blueprint them at an early age to believe that they're not good enough, that they can't do it, that it's not for them. And it's kind of trying to keep their self-esteem high whilst they're in an environment that just isn't catering for their processing needs, the way that their mind works.
Yeah. And I think that word blueprint is so, powerful, because that is the belief system that they then work on for the rest of their lives. So
they carry that with them, exactly, for the rest of
and that carries with you. I've coached women in their 50s and 60s who are brilliant women, amazing careers, have done so much, incredible external achievements, but that belief system in there, internally is still, well, I'm not good enough and I've got to just keep trying. Or, I was told at school that I just need to do things differently or be different, or try harder. And that is why they're driven. They're driven by this internal voice of, you're not good enough. So you just have to keep pushing and working harder, and rest, and they don't lean into rest or space or calm, because that means that they're not trying. And that's why this burnout is huge in the ADHD and autistic community, especially in women. So many women I speak to have gone through really debilitating cycles of burnout, because for them, not pushing and trying and working harder is scary. It doesn't feel safe to them.
So there is this overlap between ADHD and anxiety, especially in girls. How can we begin to tell what's what then, and support them both gently?
Yeah, so I always think, keep an eye on an anxious child and start maybe noticing when that comes up, how it presents, what are the traits and symptoms, and how else behaviorally does it show up for them, because you can start putting the pieces together. And again, so many women have been diagnosed with anxiety when the actual root is ADHD and autism. That's why they kind of figure out, well, why is the anti-anxiety medication not been working? I've been on it for years and it kind of works, but it kind of only just scratches the surface. They all feel that there's something else, like a motor, a restless motor of something else deeper within, that is not just the anxiety, because they don't understand what the root of the anxiety is. And again, that might be something surface level, that may be trauma as well. And someone said to me the other day, they said, all anxiety can't be neurodivergent. You can just be anxious. And I'm like, yes, but that often then shows up just in sporadic times.
Yeah.
Maybe you've had 6 weeks knowing that something's been, at work or a family thing, and that the exact driver. When you've had underlying anxiety and you've never quite been able to understand why you've had that anxiety, and you remember it as a small child, really, like, you don't remember life without anxiety, that's when I would say, let's start questioning whether there's ADHD or autism. And I talk about ADHD and autism now because there is such an overlap. And many people are getting an ADHD diagnosis and then thinking, well, there's something else going on, and they go back and get an autism diagnosis or vice versa. And I'm really glad to see that providers are doing a blanket assessment now. So not just one or the other, they're kind of doing a full assessment, because so often, you'll get the ADHD diagnosis and go, well, I can see some autistic traits there. And again, you might be more on the autistic spectrum or more on the ADHD spectrum, but there's a crossover.
Yeah, so I find that any like dyslexia and ADHD as well often intertwined, don't they? The same as dyspraxia. So there's lots of them. I think it's actually quite a high percentage, isn't it? About 80% of neurodiverse people will have more than one neurodiversity.
Oh yeah, there's always at least one or two co-occurring traits. Always OCD, anxiety, addiction, unfortunately. Highly prevalent in girls is disordered eating. So again, if you have had eating disorders throughout your life and you've never really understood why or how, I'm glad to know that it's a conversation that's starting to have in the eating disorder world, where it wasn't 5 years ago. I know it wasn't. People were being treated just for their eating disorders, nothing else, or people were just being treated for their addiction. So it's slowly trickling down, but unfortunately not fast enough. And there's still not enough neuroaffirming support and knowledge in these different areas where they need to come together. Get in the hormonal world as well. So I'm talking about mental health there, depression, anxiety, OCD. I'm talking about addiction over here. I'm talking about disordered eating over here, hormones over there. There needs to be such a much bigger holistic cohesiveness in this. And that is when you get the neurodivergent landscape. It's so important. And GPs are that first port of call. So many people message me and say, I think I've got ADHD. Where do I even start? And I say, you need to go to your GP. But that gives me a bit of fear and worry, because if they go to their GP and they go, oh, you've just got a bit of anxiety, and they palm them off, which happens all the time. We need the GPs to be that first port of call that say, you know what, I think there's some other things going on here. I'm going to refer you on. And that is what I would like.
Well, unfortunately, it's taking, even if they get a referral, isn't it? It's taking a long, long time to get a diagnosis. And I think that puts people off maybe going down the route in the first place, doesn't it?
But again, if you've been plagued with this all your life and you've really struggled, and again, I hear from too many women who have struggled for so long, for all their adult life, I would say, and, relationship breakdowns and, unfortunately, maybe hospitalization, physical health conditions. We're talking, autoimmune conditions, gut issues, migraines. It's so much of it is coexisting alongside each other in different Venn diagrams. That's how I kind of see it, and it just depends where you sit in that Venn diagram. But if that GP has that bigger picture, that bigger understanding, at least that's a bit of validation there's a bit of understanding and compassion of, you know what, maybe this is what we're discussing now. Maybe there is neurodivergence, and would that make sense to you? Like, can you see that in your family history? You know, looking back from the generations, would that be, you know, we know it's genetic. So it's just opening that dialogue, that conversation of sort of gentle curiosity, and then doing what you want with it. Maybe just knowing about it is enough for you. You might not need that official diagnosis. It's costly. It can take a lot of time. You know, costly if you don't go the NHS route. So it's a very personal thing. But for me, I always think people just get that validation from the awareness and the understanding.
I agree with that. For me, with my diagnosis and my children, I think it's that understanding and that awareness, and it helps you to be more compassionate to the struggles and to be more compassionate to yourself for your own struggles.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is key, because if you don't have that self-compassion, then you will have been driven by criticism, low self-esteem, self-criticism, negative thinking, negative spirals. And again, going back to that, you just need to try harder, do things differently, you know, be better, all of that. And if you're driven by that, what kind of life is that? But if you're driven with self-kindness, self-awareness, self-compassion, then when the challenging things come up, or when that RSD comes up, or the challenges at work, or whatever that might be, especially if we've got children, we want our children to be driven by that self-compassion. So we have to practice it ourselves, because we need to model that to them as well.
Absolutely. You've spoken about the emotional side then of ADHD, things like guilt, shame, or feeling too much. How can we support our children emotionally, not just practically?
So it goes back to that of really, you know, giving them a space to talk. You know, why did you find that difficult? Again, I'm not a perfect parent at all, and you know, like I said, I've got kids all over the place with different, you know, ADHD, but I struggle when I walk into the room and their rooms are a tip and there's towels on the floor and no one's put their glasses away, or they haven't put things in the bin and they've just left things on the floor. And I have to use a huge amount of self-control to not shout from, you know, tidy this mess, you're all slobs, you know, blah, blah, blah. But in a way, we have to give them that steerage, because I don't want them to live, you know, in a pit of mess. I want them to know that, I always say to them, it's sort of like tidy room, tidy mind. And I know it's really hard. And if you can just start somewhere, and even if you just make your bed and that's it, just start. And I know that a really messy room and you don't know where to begin with your executive functioning, that can be difficult, but guiding them a little bit, helping them, giving them that steerage, and not leading from criticism all the time, just trying to acknowledge where those challenges are, acknowledge where those difficulties may be. Or, you know, when it comes to homework, are you able to sit with them? You know, we know body doubling can really be helpful. Just saying, I know it's really hard to start your homework. It can feel really overwhelming just to open that book and know where to begin. You know, why don't you sit at the table? I'll have a cup of tea and I'm just going to help you, and then get you started. It's like giving that car a push up the hill. It's just like,
make a big difference.
That push. And, you know, is just me sitting here and doing my work next to you, that might be helpful for them. Asking them what they need without that critical lens, and trying to get them to be their own coach, I would say. Like, how often do you ask a kid, you know, what feels good to you? Like, what do you think is a good idea? Like, what helps you? What do you like? What don't you like? What do you prefer?
And it makes such a difference if they actually come up with that themselves.
Yeah, 100%. You know, I say to my daughter sometimes, what would help you tidy your room? And she says, when I put my headphones in and I can watch something on my iPad and you don't come in and tell me what to do. So I was like, fine, okay, she tidies the room in a way that maybe I wouldn't tidy my room, but if it's being done, then you do it that way. Or if, you know, she says, sometimes I put a timer on and I do it. Or I know my son works really well under pressure and urgency. Again, I think, oh, what's that doing to his nervous system and his stress levels and his cortisol? But for him, that urgency is that cortisol, that adrenaline that he needs to get over the line, with his, you know, he's going to second year university here. And I do worry, I kind of think, oh, but he does work last minute. And I can't change the way he works. And I hope that he'll figure out a way, moving forwards where his whole life isn't last minute. But I have to almost hand over that responsibility so they can figure out ways, the same way I've figured out the scaffolding in the ways that helped me. We can't take that away from them, that authority off them, because they do know, we're always our best, I'd say our experts. We just need a bit of help and support. And I think as the kids get older, we give them that bit more responsibility to know what works for them.
I love that. So Kate, have you got any final words of advice for the listeners today?
I think just go slowly with this. It can feel really overwhelming. If you are navigating a diagnosis for yourself or your children, it can feel like, oh my God, there's just so much here, so many books, so many podcasts. But just start really slowly and give yourself time to process. If you're dealing with this yourself, a lot of women go through this grieving process as they process all the things that perhaps they missed out on or couldn't do or didn't have support for, or maybe their potential wasn't fulfilled, and allow yourself to have that time. But don't sit in that place for too long, because we don't want to sit in that victim mentality. We want to be like, right, how can I now move forwards? How can I embrace this new information and this knowledge and this awareness to help myself, help my family? How can I learn from this so I don't go down the same mistakes maybe previous generations of my family went down? Like, how can I use this as a positive, as a lesson, as a springboard to creating happier, easier lives where I can thrive? And that is really the fundamental, part of what I wrote this book for. The strapline of the book, here, I've just got it here, is embracing your authentic self and harnessing your true potential. And that is, that is what I wanted to do for women when they were reading this book, like a really practical book that they can dip in and out of and learn about all different ways their ADHD is shown up, but also the positive, that how you can embrace your creativity, leaning more into joy and finding that fulfillment and simplifying your life and really leaning into and curating a life and a world that works for you now that you understand yourself. It's like you've got the key. How can you step into this new chapter? And that is exactly what I've written this book for. It's not a doom and gloom book. Yes, I validate and I showcase all the difficulties, but I use all of this and saying, right, how can you then utilize this and help yourself to move through this? And I think it's a really positive book as well.
Brilliant. Kate, I feel like there's so much valuable information in this podcast. And obviously for anybody who wants to learn more or go more in depth to this, that can be found obviously in the book, The ADHD Women's Wellbeing Toolkit. So thank you for sharing your knowledge and your insights about your own personal journey and how you've navigated that with your children, and sort of covering ADHD for women and supporting that through the podcast and just opening up this conversation more, which I think is just needed, isn't it? There are so many people who are just getting diagnosed and learning that through their children, and there's just more support needed around it. So these conversations are valuable. So Kate, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. And I just want to say that I really try and offer accessible ways of understanding and learning about ADHD. And so I just want, if anyone's listening and they are looking for more support and they haven't had a diagnosis yet, but they're wanting to learn and grow and develop themselves, I have lots of really highly accessible workshops on my website, really to help anyone wherever they are in that stage of ADHD. So if you maybe can't afford therapy or coaching, I want people to know that if you go onto my website, there's about 20, 30 different workshops that they can choose from. And I've also got a new membership community starting called More Yourself, which is there, again, really accessible pricing for women who want that help and support and maybe can't find it where they live, or don't know anyone else who has been diagnosed, or feel alone and want to feel supported. My whole point of this community is trying to find an accessible way for women to feel seen, supported, validated, and also connect. So I just wanted to say that. And if anybody is interested, they can go to my website and all the information is on there. And that's adhdwomenswellbeing.co.uk.
Lovely. And we'll share that link in the description after the podcast as well for anybody else who's interested and needs that. Lovely. Thank you, Kate.